there are a number of extremely well-meaning physicians who cluster in the no-fat vegan school of dietary recommendations. And then there are the rest of us who think that there are certain fats that not only are not bad for you, but are actually incredibly beneficial. And I think one of the big confusions, this actually began back in the 1950s when President Dwight Eisenhower suffered a heart attack. And there was consternation as how this, incredibly fit, relatively young individual who, was the general for World War II, how did he get heart disease? And so they actually wanted to know the best person to advise him. And so that best person was a researcher at the University of Minnesota by the name of Ancel Keys. Now, Keys created the K ration in World War II, hence the K. So Dr. Keys was appointed to tell Dwight Eisenhower how he got heart disease. So he was in the process of studying nutrition. That was actually his field. And he did a series of epidemiologic studies that was eventually published in the early 1970s as the 7 Countries study. Now, the 7 Countries study actually caused the fat is bad for you movement. And in fact, it caused the United States government with the McGovern Commission, yes, that McGovern, George McGovern, the former presidential candidate, to state that dietary fat was the cause of heart disease. And that recommendation prevailed for well over 30 years. In fact, it continues to this day. Now, Dr. Keys, I've studied extensively. I've read every one of his articles. I've dissected them with a fine-tooth comb. And what Dr. Keys was actually trying to say was he looked at animal fats, saturated fats from animals. And he made a correlation in these 7 countries that the more saturated fats from animals that people eat, the more heart disease. Now, interestingly enough, Dr. Keys wrote a paper many years ago that said that dietary cholesterol has nothing to do with serum cholesterol. And that's somehow missed in all of Dr. Keys' writings. He did not say that dietary cholesterol was bad for you at all. In fact, he said just the opposite. It had no effect on cholesterol. But he was quite adamant that saturated fat from animals was bad. Now, the people who pick him apart, primarily from the paleo community and the ketogenic community, said, no. Dr. Keys was a cherry picker. And he took the worst 7 countries, and in his study, he was actually looking at 21 countries. And he threw out all the other countries that didn't match his data. And so that's why he called it the 7 country study. But there have been other people, particularly Denise Minger, who have re-looked at his data with modern statistical analysis and found, in fact, that Dr. Keys was pretty right in that if you threw in all those other 21 countries, the overall trend would show that animal saturated fats impact health. In the book, The Longevity Paradox, I come not to bury Dr. Keys, but to actually praise him. And here's why I praise him. Dr. Keys never said that fat was a problem. What he said was that animal fat was a problem. And in fact, interestingly enough, Dr. Keys, when he retired from the University of Minnesota, retired to a little village south of Naples, Italy, where he lived right next to the village called Acciaroli, which has the oldest percentage of people in the world. It was not mentioned in the blue zones because Dan Butner didn't know about it. But they have more people over 100 years of age. 30% of the population is over 100 than any place in the world. And Dr. Keyes lived right next to that village. And I think he lived there not by accident, but by choice. And I've actually had the opportunity to interview Dr. Keyes' housekeeper, and he ate a huge amount of olive oil, as you would anticipate someone who moved to the south of Italy. So rather than demonizing oils, Dr. Keyes actually wanted people to realize that there was a difference between animal saturated fat and plant-based fats, particularly monounsaturated fats like olive oil. So that's a long-winded way of saying that the father of anti-fat was not anti-fat at all. Now, unfortunately, my colleagues of the anti-fat have really not looked at the data that Dr. Key assembled, nor at the data that's been done before. So let's get back to olive oil. If you look at Dr. Clapper's videos, he'll tell you that olive oil is full of fat. Yeah, duh. Olive oil is fat, and he says that fat makes you fat. Well, if we've learned anything from the ketogenic movement, we know that in fact, fat does the exact opposite. Fat does not make you fat. Carbohydrates make you fat. Give you an example. Years ago, after World War II, the United States had a lot of coconut available to us after we took over or liberated a lot of the Philippines, a lot of Indonesia, and we had a lot of pigs to feed. And interestingly enough, it seems like, well, we've got a lot of coconuts, and coconuts are pretty much pure fat, so we ought to use those coconuts to fatten pigs for market. Sounds like a great idea, and incidentally, I grew up in Omaha, Nebraska during those times. The more coconut we fed to pigs, the skinnier the pigs got. The skinnier they got, not the fatter they got, even though we were basically feeding them pure fat. Well, we're not pigs, you say. Well, actually, we carry the same metabolic digestive system that pigs do. So if you want to call your loved one a big fat pig, you're actually speaking the truth. So what is it about olive oil that's so evil then? Well, in fact, there was a study in Spain that was published just a couple of years ago. And what they did was they took 65-year-old people and they divided them into 3 groups, all of whom ate a Mediterranean diet. The first group had to use a liter of olive oil per week. Now, that's a huge amount of olive oil. My wife and I try to use a liter per week. We usually get there, but that's about 12 to 14 tablespoons a day. They actually had them come to the clinic once a week, exchange their liter of olive oil for a new bottle, and that's how they knew they were doing it. The second group had to eat a Mediterranean diet, but they had to use the same calories of raw walnuts as the olive oil group. The third group had a low-fat Mediterranean diet, exactly what Dr. Clapper would recommend. But they had to eat the same calories, which means they had to get those calories from primarily carbohydrates. So they were followed for 4 years. The original purpose of the study was to look at memory. At the end of 4 years, both the walnut group and the olive oil group had preserved memory. In fact, both of those groups had improved memory over 4 years earlier. Now, think about that, just let that sink in. So at 69, 2 of those groups had better memory than when they were 65. And that obviously goes against what we think about aging. The low-fat group, on the other hand, had diminished memory. In other words, they followed what we would assume to be the normal trajectory of getting older. So the fat group, either olive oil or walnuts, their brain was better. The low-fat group, their brain was worse. Now it gets even more interesting. they said, hey, we got a lot of data on a lot of people. Let's see what else is interesting. So they broke down cardiovascular disease. And at the end of 4 years, lo and behold, the olive oil group had the best outcomes in avoiding cardiovascular disease. That means stroke, heart attacks, stents, bypass surgery, or peripheral vascular disease. The walnut group was right behind them. And guess what? The low-fat group came in last. They had the most cardiovascular disease compared to the other two groups. But it gets even better than that. Women were followed for breast cancer. And it turns out that only the olive oil group had a 67% less risk of breast cancer than the other two groups. The low-fat group did the worst. So wait a minute. We've got all these people eating all this fat. I mean, a liter of olive oil per week. That's a huge amount of calories, and yet they do better on every outcome. But here's the best part. The olive oil group lost the most weight. They actually lost weight over the 4 years, even though they were forced, the poor devils, to drink 12 to 14 tablespoons of olive oil per day. The low-fat group gained weight during those 4 years, even though they weren't eating the fat. So when somebody tells you that fat is fat and fat makes you gain weight, I've got some oceanfront property in Palm Springs to sell you. It absolutely isn't true. And that goes to the theory that calories in equals calories out, and that the only way you can gain weight is to either eat less calories or exercise more. And we know for a fact that that is actually not true, because it never accounts for the bacteria in our gut microbiome eating anything. Okay? So the point is, olive oil is one of the best sources for polyphenols. And if you watch me long enough, you know that polyphenols are actually what's going to make the difference in your health. So I'll say it again. The only purpose of food is to get olive oil into your mouth. And Ansel Keys was right.